Let's stay with this particular theme and speak now to Faith Abiodun, who is the International Affairs Analyst, founder and chair of Future Africa Foundation, a public sector development organization. Faith, thank you so much for your time. Let's start with the posture that Africa should be taking going into this particular summit.
Thank you very much for bringing me on. The key challenge here for Africa is to be able to distinguish itself in its partnerships with nations outside of the continent. This summit in particular brings together lots of African countries into Russia. Of course, a good number not represented by the presidents, but even the presidents who are present in Russia are high-profile presidents. And the key thing is for African countries to be able to be on the front foot about both their economic future and about the security future for the continent. The summit has been declared to be focused on economic and humanitarian affairs as well as security, and this is a very, very big subject for the continent. If we think about the Black Sea Grain Deal, which was signed last year with the partnership of Turkey, it was very important for African countries, particularly countries in East and Southern Africa, to be able to free very relevant grain supplies and fertilizer supplies, as well as cooking oil supplies. And the food security crisis, in particular in East and Southern Africa, makes it very, very critical. If you think about countries like Sudan, countries like Mali, that rely heavily on the Wagner paramilitary group, this is very important for them to be able to strike their own deals with Russia about what matters for them. For countries in the West, this is quite a challenge because it's almost like a redefining of the global order, and Russia is trying to restake its claim in this partnership in spite of the fact that there's a war afoot. So this really is opportune for Russia. It could be opportune for African countries, but it's quite a challenging time to be trying to really streamline this relationship and ensure that there's sufficient value for African countries.
And talking about, the timing of it all, I mean, you think about what the Kremlin has said, accusing the West, in particular the US, of trying to sabotage this particular summit. At the same time, you're looking at African leaders who some are saying that they may be put in an awkward position given the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine. I wonder if Africa is in a peculiar or an advantageous position here.
It could really be to Africa's advantage, to be honest, because if we think about the fact that other countries across the world have, in quotes, summoned African leaders to come to them for the summits. Japan has done this, Turkey has done this, the US has done this, France has done this. So there have been a number of bilateral summits that are unevenly balanced, always in the favor of the country that's inviting. So when the US-Africa summit takes place, you have nearly every African head of state heading over there. The rest of the world equally has to be able to play in this game, and no one owns Africa, as it were. But when you've got a global war afoot and countries have to pick sides, inevitably, African countries have to be a little bit smart about how they hedge their bet. Now, in a multipolar world, African countries cannot afford to be on the side of the US or on the side of Russia. They've got to be able to play the game with any country to their own advantage. For far too long, foreign countries have dictated the game that African countries must play. But this could really be to our advantage, to African countries' advantage, being able to decide how to align themselves. Now, you would know that a good number of African countries chose to be non-aligned in the conflict, in the war between Russia and Ukraine. Many African countries chose almost a middle ground of neutrality. As a matter of fact, you had a number of heads of state who were heading over to both Ukraine and Russia, including President Ramaphosa, trying to play the role of a mediator. These are roles that African countries have typically not been invited to or been expected to play. So this could really be to African countries' advantage, proving that they can work with the US, they can work with France, they can work with Ukraine, they can work with Russia. As long as we're equal partners at the table, this could really be to advantage. So I'm really in favor of African countries being able to show up here. Of course, we condemn the conflict and we want to see peace in the world. But at the end of the day, if the grain supplies for Kenya, which is obviously going through a really serious food security crisis across all of East Africa, to be honest, if they can free up grain for themselves, and if you read Putin's latest message, there was mention of free supplies of grain, which is an economic lever for African countries to consider. If you look at the economy of Ukraine, close to 10% of their GDP is driven from food and fertilizer exports. So if African countries can save themselves some money and get that grain for free from Russia while being able to still work with other countries, it's a win-win. But these are really, tricky geopolitical conversations to navigate. And it's good that a number of African countries are going to be in Russia for these conversations.
And, taking a step back in time and, looking back at 2019, there were some agreements, memoranda, some contracts that were signed in that previous summit and, some placing them at over 90. Have these, in your view and analysis, yielded any result?
Results are always slow in bilateral affairs and even more so in multilateral affairs. You have a number of African countries that come together and look for deals in the area of agriculture. They look for deals in the area of security, in the area of mining. There are a number of really critical sectors in which these deals are signed. The implementation of these deals, however, often require lots more parties to be involved. Sometimes the national parliaments have to get involved. We have to get the private sector involved. There's a lot that has to happen beneath the table. It goes way beyond the symbolic sign of agreements. So for African countries, of course, we don't know the details of how each country chooses to implement its deals. One of the things that African countries have stated recently, especially President William Ruto from Kenya, was to ensure that African countries do not get summoned as a collective to come to these conversations that do not actually work for them bilaterally, unilaterally, as standalone countries. They have recommended that the African Union rather should represent all the African countries when you have these multilateral deals, which should then create room for countries like South Africa to have a bilateral agreement with Russia. So I am very skeptical about multilateral forums, especially where you have one partner inviting 54 partners. It's never going to be equal, and it's never going to work at a direct tailored level for each African country. So I am very skeptical about how much progress has been made. Again, that was 2019. The year afterwards, COVID hit and shook up the whole world. And then last year, the war took over. So I think this is an attempt to almost rebuild those relationships. Again, you have to read in between the lines. And this is really strategic for Russia, less so for Africa. And especially when you talk about, really what has happened and some of the skepticism around this, the skepticism is also on the fact that there appears to have been, like Leon was saying a little earlier on, a huge gap between Russia and Africa that has been growing also over the years. And it's something that they possibly need to address. Absolutely. I mean, the economic balance is not equal. It's not even. Again, because it's for me, it's very bizarre that we have a Russia-Africa summit, because that is almost neo-colonialism. You think one partner really can work with a number of African countries at an aggregate level. That is not going to work out properly. So yes, there's an economic imbalance between the two parties. And in this case, you'll be hoping that each African country, Egypt, Ethiopia, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Zambia, can find their own one-on-one time with the private sector players, with the parliamentary players, to be able to define what the right outcomes for them will be. Now, we know for a number of countries, the primary challenge for them is security. Wagner is a paramilitary agency, should not really be the subject of a conversation between state parties. But we know that Russia and Wagner have had even a recent time in which the leader of Wagner was suspected of mutiny in Russia. So it's very important that for countries like Sudan, like Mali, that will never actually admit publicly the contract Wagner for security in exchange for gold, it's very important they can have these conversations, while South Africa can have a parallel conversation, while Kenya can have a parallel conversation. So one is expecting a lot from a two-day summit. It's hardly ever going to achieve enough for each party, which is why the balance is way too uneven. I am very skeptical about the outcomes, but symbolically at the surface level, it could be quite a win for African diplomacy on a global stage to show that we can work with multiple partners and still be accepted with the other partners who will prefer for the summit to not go ahead. Tricky times, really.
Tricky times indeed. Faith, thank you so much. I do appreciate that analysis. That is Faith Abiodun, International Affairs Analyst, founder and chair of Future Africa Foundation, a public sector development organization.